everybody, how's it going? Thanks for joining me this afternoon. I've got a great stream with a great guest that I think you're really going to enjoy. Before we get started today, I just want to remind you that one of the ways we keep the lights on around here is, of course, subscriptions to Blaze TV. Not only will you be supporting this show, you'll get behind-the-scenes access to all your favorite Blaze TV personalities, and you'll be able to watch every episode uncensored. You'll get great documentaries and so much more. So head over to blazetv.com/Auron and use that to get $20 off your subscription today. That's blazetv.com/Auron for $20 off your subscription today. All right, guys, we obviously have had about a year since my guest was here last, and he made some really important predictions, ones that I think have probably altered somewhat since the events that have occurred, especially around Charlie Kirk and everything that came after his assassination. So I wanted to have him back on to discuss how he thinks our situation has changed. Rudyard Lynch, thank you so much for coming on, man.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure.
Absolutely. Like I said, you're somebody who spends a lot of time, got a very popular YouTube channel discussing how civilizations work and how they come apart. And you're famous for specifically the topic of how they might come apart in a violent conflict. So I wanted to see if you think we're any closer to that, any further away. Have these intervening events changed your mind as to where the country is going? But before we get to all that, guys, let's talk about today's sponsor. Everyone knows that college is a major investment, so it's really important to do your research. You want to find a school that shares your values, but who has the time to dig through all those college websites? Well, today I've got great news for you. There's a free, easy-to-use resource that does the work for you. It's called ChristianCollegeGuide.com. This online directory of over 250 Christian colleges and universities is a one-stop shop. ChristianCollegeGuide.com lists all the basics such as acceptance rates, tuition costs, and academic majors. But here's what makes this resource truly special. ChristianCollegeGuide.com will show you the school's faith commitments, its campus policies, and its spiritual life. All the info that you will need to find the college you can trust. This is the definitive college guide for Christian higher education, and it's completely free. So if you or someone you know is considering college, go to ChristianCollegeGuide.com to create a free user profile and start today. It's ChristianCollegeGuide.com. All right, guys, before we get started, also just want to let you know this is pre-recorded, so we won't be able to answer super chats today. Sorry about that. So, Rudyard, last time you were on, you made a prediction that if Trump was elected, we would see as many as 1,000 political assassinations before May. I think you said you had something writing on that. You may have had to pay that out. But interestingly, while we didn't get the magnitude of what you were talking about, the political assassination we got almost feels like 1,000. It feels like it was incredibly critical, especially to the integrity of the conservative movement, as we kind of see the aftermath spinning out from what happened with Charlie Kirk's death. So I guess my first question would be, why do you think we didn't get the level of violence you expected? But why was the violence we got so important?
I was demonstratively incorrect, and I'll start with that. And I don't feel bad about that, though. In retrospect, when I look back on it, I think I was making a reasonable calculation. I just turned out to be wrong because, and I've been trying to figure out what really went wrong, where in the last year, it's been quite strange, where it's as if the global system keeps fraying and the elites are making the decision they'd rather have complete social breakdown than try to stop the process to hold more of the pie, if that makes sense. Where I think we've seen a progressive breakdown of the society in like the last year. And we've seen the mainstream right-wing elites or the boomer cons not really being willing to take a stand here. And also just the centripetal entropy of the system is stopping changes. And it's strange that I go on a lot of these podcasts, and a year is a long time in the internet's world, but in the grand scheme of history, a year is absolutely nothing. And so because my background's in history, if this happens 5 years late, that will be a short period of time. But I do still believe the things I said earlier. And I think what's going to happen is the system will inevitably break. And every year we forestall it, the amount of unsolved issues piles up and up.
Yeah, I agree that a lot of the things you were pointing to are issues that have simply not been resolved. And if they're not resolved, the pressure must build. So simply because it didn't blow up today doesn't mean it won't, the jack in the box will eventually pop, right? If you guess the wrong crank turn at which it comes out of the box, okay, you were wrong about that, but the truth is eventually the crank will hit the spot where it comes out of the box. And so I think anytime you're making predictions, as you say, especially ones that are based on historical analysis, the tighter you make those predictions, the tighter the timeline is, the harder it is to nail it down. The trends are more observable over time. And interestingly enough, I did not expect the amount of violence you did, but I certainly expected more violence than we got initially, right? I looked at all of these people saying Trump is a fascist, Trump is Hitler, this is the rise of the Third Reich, we have to stop it now, our democracy is under attack. And I thought, okay, they can't walk this rhetoric back, right? And we already know that the left is violent. We've already seen the Summer of Love. We know what they're capable of. So if Trump comes back and all this rhetoric is behind his return, clearly they'll have to take some level of action. What was interesting is initially they kind of seemed just blown away, right? Like the left just kind of fell over. They were in turmoil. They had said all the right words. They had made Trump a scary bad man, but still they couldn't figure out what to do about the fact that rhetoric had failed. But it turns out after a few months, especially of Trump winning, getting these different accomplishments, getting the ICE raids, and all of a sudden, these kind of things start playing out. Now we start to see the violent left come out. It took a few months of them cooking in kind of, I guess, this stew of Trump's accomplishments to end up in this scenario where they were willing to take action. And it was less organized action on the top-down, Democratic Party official organs of the left, on that basis, and more it was kind of this wildcat terrorism, affiliated with ideologies and Antifa, but not getting any direct contact with the leftist elites. So in a way, I think we did see the level of violence I kind of eventually expected, but there was this interesting delay mechanism that had to occur. What do you think about the kind of the time it took for the left to spool up and start to fight back in a violent fashion?
I agree with you there. I was surprised at how long it took. And I also assumed they dispute this election, where this election was closer than a lot of people think. And maybe if it was a little bit closer, the left would have disputed it because the last two elections were. One of the trends people on the right don't spot that they probably should is the left has seen a severing on a generational basis, where the Zoomer leftists have lost trust with the CNN, NBC leftists, the DNC leftists. And so the Zoomer leftists are getting their news from TikTok, which has no factual basis. And it's crazy to see the rhetoric as well, where last winter there was a social media trend called cute winter boots. And it was saying how you needed to buy cute winter boots to launch terrorism. And this is just the most feminine call for violence ever. But you also saw the burning of Tesla stations. There was the map of all the Tesla owners, so you could hurt and vandalize them. So this was going on. And I go through periodic sort of intellectual obsessions. I have 3 or 4 a year. And one of my recent ones has been Nietzsche's Age of the Last Men. And that's the only narrative I can really use to explain why this situation is operating in the way it is. And I could articulate that more if you'd like, but I think it also matters that the average age is 40. I think a population whose average age is 40, and that's historically unprecedented, will take longer to go to violence than one where the average age is 25, like a pre-industrial society.
No, and you're far from the first person to point that out, and I think that's correct, that ultimately having a older and unfit society means you're less likely to get violence. Young men at 20 with nothing to lose are usually your revolutionary cohort. Like, they're the ones who go into foxholes. They're the ones that do terrorism. Whatever kinetic action is going to occur, it's going to come from, young men being angry at 20 years old and not thinking that they have a future, which we're going to get to here in a minute. Don't worry. But I do think it's interesting also that sorry, I lost. You had the 40-year-old. What was your original point as well? I had
Nietzsche's Age of the Last
yes,
Men. Do you
yes.
want me to
Thank you.
explain that?
Sure. Yeah, we can go into. I've actually done an episode on this as well, but it's good to refresh our audience. Yeah, can you talk a little bit about what we would now call the bug men, but what Nietzsche called the last man, the man who for whom little pleasures and are the real thing that makes life worth living for.
Nietzsche's Last Man was a concept from the late 19th century, and he's one of the authors who's incredibly prophetic. Um, I put him in a similar category to Gustave Le Bon, who I think you'd really love as a writer. But Nietzsche was a 19th century thinker, and he predicted that by the time of the early 21st century, where he said it would take 2 centuries to work through this, and no one would really understand his teachings before the year 2000, is that the Western world would be consumed by a society that would put envy, complacency, and mediocrity as the ultimate moral goods. And this would destroy sort of the human soul, so that the West would be committing suicide, where it would be too weak to live or procreate or survive. And this would create the greatest civilizational crisis in Western history that he thought would ultimately be defeated. And he sees the Age of the Last Man as sort of transitory time period, not an actual endpoint of Western civilization, which is good. All of the historic authors who predict this current crisis say we're going to get through it. At least the ones who are willing to see beyond just we will have this crisis to what will its consequences be. And I can't unsee The Last Men because I'm constantly comparing this society to historic societies. And weird thing about modernity versus pre-modern is there are differences. There's more continuities from the world 2,000 years ago to today than almost any modern people think. But there are differences in modern and pre-modern societies. And one of the ones I kept spotting was just the staggering absence of masculinity in leadership today. And if people ask me, Rudyard, why do you think the system's still going to fall? It's because this is a system which has designed itself to be utterly inflexible through bureaucracy with no place for masculine leadership. And it's already barreling towards failure. And it is removed all of the mechanisms to redirect.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth there. You know, that again, one of the stunning things, and this is what me think, how I can tell we really are in the age of last men here, is there seems to be nothing that will trigger a violent response.
Yeah.
Like nothing seems radical enough, right? Like someone can steal your kids from you and chop their genitals off. They can, and there's just there seems to be no line, and that's stunning. I mean, again, that's what Nietzsche would have predicted, right? Like that it's any kind of conflict is too much. Anything that disrupts your ability to have the little creature comforts is too much. That this is how kind of the bug man, the last man, lives and dies. And there's nothing worth fighting or dying for. There's nothing worth agitating. Nothing worth going out and fighting for to prove a point. And you can tell this because, again, so many of these Western nations, no matter how tyrannical their governments get, there's just no there. You'll get a few riots in England. You might get one in Ireland. You might get January 6th in America. But ultimately, and Curtis Yarvin has pointed this out in a funny way, the way he frames it is Americans simply aren't virtuous enough to have a revolution anymore. We don't have that quality in us anymore, and he basically plans for that. This is kind of one of the things I don't like about Curtis, even though I think he's probably right at some level. His solutions are all based on the idea that we will never have a population capable of that level of violence, that level of vigor, that level of animating spirit again. And while of course I'm not hoping for violence, anybody who looks at history knows there at some point there has to be a line that doesn't get crossed, right? Like there has to be something that triggers your desire to defend yourself against existential threats. And it just seems, especially when you look at what happened with Charlie Kirk, the first thing that everybody ran out and did and says, nobody react. Now, in a sense, I get that, right? Like, again, I don't want vigilante violence. But at some level, there is a healthy level of anger and reaction that would come with something like that. But not only could the right not summon any kind of energy on that level, instead of even turning their guns, figuratively, turning their governmental power on the left and destroying like left-wing terrorist organizations, they just made a circular firing squad and started sniping at their own conservatives.
Yeah, there's a lot of really interesting threads to pull at. I'll pick a few, but that's a rich topic. One of which is Nietzsche said the age of the last man could be brought down by 100 capable men, because the age would produce such weakness and such indecision that it's profoundly weak. And I want to emphasize that. And I'm not black-pilled because I spend a lot of time in sort of conservative youth circles. And I think there is genuinely a tremendous amount of capability and willpower there that is being wasted. And when I look at the right, I just made a video analyzing my thoughts in the woke right. I know I'm a few months behind it, but inside it, I sort of talk about the anthropology of the modern right, and I give you a few good shout outs in there too. But one of the things I say is that you have ethnic conservatives, book conservatives, and internet conservatives. Did you get into conservatism from reading books from the internet, or are you from like a conservative hometown where it's a culture you grew up in? And these are wildly different, where the internet conservatives have sort of captured the movement online, and the internet conservatives have these weird incentive structures where they're always self-predating off each other because the contentious stuff is what gets big online. This doesn't really fit, but the institutional conservatives, you could classify them as book conservatives. A lot of them are very academic and coastal, and they don't have a relation to Red America. And then the ethnic conservatives can't get into the positions of power because I think there is the capability to stop this tyranny. It's just all of the mechanisms of power in our society are bureaucracies, and bureaucracies are naturally feed into the left. And so you have to make a leadership structure that's non-bureaucratic, that could displace the bureaucracies so we don't end up playing the left's game. And I think that's actually really possible and really sort of powerful, because if you make a non-bureaucratic leadership structure, it will utterly consume the bureaucracies by just being more competent and more capable.
I agree 100%. This is literally, a huge part of my argument, which I'm sure you're aware of, but I literally was just making this pitch to some rather important people. And this is critical. We have to address the structural issue here, that the system we are pushing is inherently going to keep us left wing. We can't avoid anything else. So yeah. I think that is just so important. And it's extremely difficult because a lot of people can only, you totally understand it, but this recency bias, right? Like the way the world works now is the only way the world can work. There's just no other time or place we could, do this, or we've moved beyond the ability to have any other way that we could organize our societies. And so therefore we're just stuck with Leviathan, and you just got to learn how to pilot Leviathan. And there are a lot of people I like who truly believe this. So like, it's just base Leviathan. That's all. I mean, ultimately that's kind of what Sam Francis came to at the end of his, even though he understood how and why this mechanism drives us. He's like, but there's just no way to avoid this. So we've got to figure out how to drive this. But I'm 100% with you that because of the way we have structured our institutions, it will select for leftists. It will select for a particular type of manager, leader who will have this very hyper feminized leadership style, will have this really agreeable, dissipated, really psychoanalyzed way to address all of these things, heavily therapeutic society. And until we break out of that, we will just be manufacturing the last man. We will create C.S. Lewis's Men Without Chess. We're a Man Without Chess factory at this point because of the way we structured society. And if you don't change that incentive structure and who gets selected and put into positions of power, then you can't get a circulation of elites that would actually change where we're going.
I made a system called Fluffy, and Fluffy is a leadership structure where you have 3 tiers, and you basically have competition inside an organization of people who rise to leadership, and then their employees choose which leader they want to follow. And so you have internalized competition inside an organization between these private leadership. And so you have competition from the top, that leaders who are not effective get axed by the system, or they get axed by the system. And you also have competition from below, that if you're not productive enough, you get pruned from the system. And so this is based off sort of earlier leadership systems that are non-bureaucratic, because the thing bureaucracy is missing is leadership. And leadership is the ability of the conscious mind to go through something and clean it out. And the reason our society feels so broken is we've totally removed leadership. So staggeringly irrational things occur because it's just unconscious.
Yeah, everything is a call center tree, right? If you've ever experienced when you're calling someone, or if you've even worked in a call center, you know they're not actually looking to solve your problem. They're running through a list of solutions that have been set up for them. They have outsourced their entire thinking apparatus. They are in every way, shape, or form thinking as a computer. Here is my input. When I get this input, then I give this output. And there is no actual way to work through any problems. You're never really addressing the issue. And that means that if there was not someone ahead of you who laid out the way in which this had to be approached, then you kind of fail. And the problem is that leadership in our society is specifically punished because we are so litigious that the first thing anyone does when they enter into a managerial structure is basically try to avoid any responsibility. And the way you avoid responsibility is to bring in other managers who are saying you're doing the right thing. So you bring in consultants, or you use standard operating procedures or best practices. And then if something goes wrong and you're a manager, you can say, it's not my fault. I brought in McKinsey. I brought in whoever. I use the structure. I use, and those things are irrefutable. And so therefore you are kind of absolved of any actual liability for mistakes that you make. But this, as important as recognizing that structure is, it does make us ask questions about what happened after Charlie Kirk's death. Because again, I guess we understand, you have the last men, and they're not going to rise to violence or anything against, what happened with Charlie Kirk. But why the breakdown in the conservative movement itself? Why was that the response? Why are we still seeing at this stage different factions of the right using this as an opportunity to snipe at each other rather than go after the left?
Charlie Kirk was a real wake-up call where I sort of knew the internet was that bad, because I hear these reverberations too. I also see how bloodthirsty the audience is. But Charlie Kirk really showed that, where even moderate leftists, they were okay with it, or they openly defended it. And that makes you see the world very differently, that at least half of this nation openly wants you dead. And it's been depressing to look at the last year of the right, because sort of the strategic deck we had with this last election was pretty good. Trump had MAGA, you had Elon bringing in the tech guys, and you had then you had also the RFK disenchanted Democrats. The problem is that the boomer cons are still fundamentally blue-pilled. They cannot imagine a world where the left does not dominate society, because they've lived in that their entire lives. And so when pedal came to the metal, the boomer cons were too complacent and decadent to do anything. And the issue with the internet right is it's just acidic, and it's kind of disgusting to watch, where you look at the Groypers, and the Groypers have been such an issue for any conservative coalition building, because they attack any policies that would work. They're straw men for the least popular defensible positions, and they're sort of an acid to coalition building. So you have the decadent boomer cons, and you have a lot of acidic internet conservatism, and then you have a total lack of mechanisms of power. And mechanisms of power is a concept I have from it. There's a 4-volume political history of political power. And a mechanism of power is, do we have a consistent institution that allows you to operate over fields over time. And I explain that poorly, but what I tell people is the number one thing that like a wealthy patron could do for the conservative movement is just to pay for young, smart conservatives to not starve, that they're not dependent on the leftist managerial system, because there's millions of paid Democrats and about 10,000 paid Republicans. And what that means is that if you're a paid Democrat, your entire life is pushing this. And so they amass a significant amount of cultural power. And what we realized was the right's lack of leadership institutions and mechanisms of power meant that even though we had a really good hand with control of the executive, the legislative, and the judicial, you didn't have the ability to really enforce change on a long-term basis.
So we just found out that Crooks, the attempted assassin of Donald Trump, was big into like furry online deviant art stuff. We used they, them, trans pronouns. Of course, we also know Tyler Robinson was in this furry gay relationship, trans relationship. And of course, we've had 2 churches shot up by trans shooters in the last year. And so we have this scenario where it's very obvious that there is a pipeline of leftist violence occurring here. To some extent, the Trump administration has acknowledged that. The good news is they just named Antifa a foreign terrorist group, so they can expand the amount of power to go after them, chase down these mechanisms that kind of fund and feed into this. But ultimately, this is a sickness of the soul. Like, it's very clear that these men are being radicalized by online leftist propaganda, and that process is being intentionally funded by, I think, larger forces. But we also have a truly spiritual issue, and the fact that these guys, many people have called them the tranissaries of kind of the system now. These are the violent assassins, kind of castrated by their trans obsession and then sent out in the world to do violence on behalf of the regime. This kind of really effective process of turning these people into kind of violent agents of the left. Do you see the left ever recognizing the danger of that? And is there any way will simply ending Antifa funding these kind of things, will that ultimately dissuade that? Or is this just the result? Are these the last men that have just gone completely the other direction, where they don't sublimate themselves to the system and they would just rather spin out and just kill everyone who they've been told is to blame for where they are as last men, rather than just kind of fade into the background and get their little pleasures?
In the longhouse cultures of Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islanders, as far as I can tell, and the anthropology is not very good, they all practice headhunting, because in the longhouse cultures where the den mother watches all the young men, some young men go crazy and take the pickled heads of their enemies. And so I see it as a sort of similar phenomena where or in the ancient Cybele cult that worshipped the devouring mother goddess of ancient Middle East and Turkey and whatever, the priests of Cybele would crush their own testicles for the mother goddess. And so I see it as sort of an archetypal similarity, that once you worship the castrating mother goddess, you end up with these weird sort of degenerate satanic priests.
Interesting. Yeah, no, I could definitely see how that would build. Yeah, you kind of have this scenario where the only system that's presented to them is this orientation on the hyper feminine, on the longhouse, and so rather than even exist inside of it, they don't know how to fight back against it, so they just kind of self-immolate as an offering to this goddess. That is an interesting way to look at it, and I think probably has some serious truth in it. Well, one of the things that is, did you have more to say on that one?
There's something I'll throw in there as well, and I was considering bringing this up, but I was waiting till you would. But the the modern frame is so broken from historic norms that people don't even know what they're looking at. And I find Christians are basically the only demographic that has their own distinct moral access that they can morally judge the society. Because Christians are the only people in modern America, by and large, as a demographic, who have some remnants of a pre-modern worldview. And Christianity has its own moral compass and access that exists independent from the society, because the society's moral axis is basically everything's permissible as long as you don't physically hurt someone. And what that leaves out is that we are staggeringly immoral through not doing things. There's the morality of not doing things, and there's the morality of doing things. And we're a society where letting your entire people die is the moral thing to do. And from an earlier moral frame, that's staggeringly immoral. Same thing as selling your soul to the machine, a variety of things. But people can't really see outside of our bubble because they're so taken in by it.
I'm glad you just mentioned that because, of course, a lot of things that people will talk about when it comes to the genius of the American system and those kind of things is that we have negative rights, right? These are things that the government must not do to you. But positive rights are the problem, right? Duties that the government has, those are issues and things we try to avoid. And in a way, that makes sense. But at the same time, it also, I think, makes people miss what virtue is about. Because as you point out, virtue is about action, not lack of action. Like, yeah, emotional continence and these kind of things are about not spurging out and screaming or doing whatever. But there's also affirmative goods, roles you must fill in order to reach your telos, to achieve virtue in your role. And so when you live in a society where all of the values are about what you shouldn't do and just negation and just that, you have those negative rights, but rarely encodes an affirmative, we need to take this action, this role, this virtue forward, then yeah, you do kind of create this scenario, this particularly liberal scenario, where you don't have any kind of transcendent tie to ground you in history and to other people who lived in what would be a more classic virtue ethics type centered society. And so you lose that frame. So there's nothing, which I think is why even in amongst Christianity, and I say this as an evangelical, we are getting a lot more people who are looking for, pre-modern Christianity. They're looking for, Catholicism, or even more really, I think, Orthodoxy because of its mysticism. And these are kind of the less, they're less touched by modernity in a way, though I would argue Catholicism is currently facing quite an issue with that as well. But we can kind of tell that that's ultimately what people are yearning for, even inside the Protestant world. It's more people looking at like Reformed Protestant Christianity as opposed to kind of like mega church evangelicalism, because no matter what strain you're looking at, they're all kind of trying to find that Christianity that does have that transcendent tie and that historical tie and is not completely corrupted by kind of modernity and its processes.
I think something was really lost in the switch from pre-modern to modern Christianity with trying to make Christianity into a rational ethical code rather than a spiritual path. Because I read this book from this Russian World War I era author, and he said, the thing you have to understand about Christianity is it's actually about God, and it's actually about the spiritual element. And he explained it through that lens, and I thought, wait, that makes sense, and it totally reprograms all of the modernist ideals in the topic between so the reason that in the pre-modern world that you could have Christian societies that had relentless class oppression and had colonies and that stuff is they hadn't mentally tried to convert Christianity into a secular moral code. They just saw it as a religion. And the issue that people are sort of mentally wrapping their minds around is modernity actively basically beats people from the cradle onwards to not think in mythic terms. And so you're having people whose neurology wasn't trained for this, trying to grasp for a basic human biological need that's been denied to their entire society. And so they're sort of like grappling around. And so, as an example, I know a lot of people who are into Greek Orthodoxy, who are normal American. They're not ethnically Orthodox people. And it's
Right.
because Greek Orthodoxy has this sort of thing they're trying to reach to a greater degree than the Western churches. But the Greek Orthodox Church was not the church of St. Augustine, where people would see a relic and then just start spasming with sort of divine ecstasy. That's something you can read about in earlier societies, but is very rare today.
Yeah, no, I like the very specific, that it's about God, not about a moral code. You can really feel Immanuel Kant and his consequences have been a disaster.
Yeah.
That the need to try to turn everything into a categorical imperative. There's some objective system where that's what really Christianity is valuable as, is this rational system of ethical codes rather than being a real religion tied to the metaphysical truths. Um, and that is, of course, as you point out, why people are especially looking at orthodoxy, because it does allow for that mysticism that has been driven out of most Western Christianity. Another issue that you and I talked about previously that is recirculated back into the news has been the ability of young men to start families and have houses. And Donald Trump famously talked about the 50-year mortgage here recently, which had a lot of people, including conservatives, pretty upset. Now, at some level, you understand what he's trying to do. Well, if I get the payment long enough, they can afford or if I get the loan long enough, the payment will go down enough to be affordable, and then people can own houses. But obviously, if you are looking at this from anything but like a purely financial metric, you realize that this is a disastrous way to live, being tied to this debt for basically your entire life. And if you got a house at 30, probably dying before you actually pay off the house. Some people have said, this is basically like neo-feudalism. What do you think about this approach? Is there any saving the housing market? Is there any way beyond the 50-year mortgage we could actually fix this problem? I mean, I've made my own suggestions, but it seems bizarre to me that this is the one the Trump administration went to, and not more mass deportations, not keeping corporations from buying up residential housing. Why this particular solution?
So there's a series of sort of different crystallizing events going on here that no one has words for. And so it's going to be difficult to articulate. One of which is that the economy is almost entirely artificial. It's really a wonder that the economy has made it this far and the housing markets have, because almost any metric you'd look at besides total GDP or the stock market has collapsed precipitously. And the reasoning is the government can just print infinite money, and the entire global order is a shared bluff. We just haven't called it yet. And so they're maintaining the bluff. And so you have these weird outsized effects like the 50-year loan. And another thing as well is, I think, and this is something I only realized in the last few months, most people today's identity is purely based off social status. And so they need to get the house. They need to go into the dating game. They need to work extra hours because that's their identity, and they don't have another reset button. And so you see these sort of status spirals get out of control because there's no reset button. And it's not a good situation. And I don't think this can last another year, because next year the interest on our debt is going to be more than defense and Medicare combined.
Yeah, it's one of those things where this is one of those problems where the libertarians are right, but they don't understand the implications of their own being right. So you're absolutely correct that the debt, financing, our whole economy is fake. Inflated money, markets are completely artificial at this point. These are all things that are absolutely true. And so kind of the libertarian idea is, well, we just kind of cut these things back and everything kind of right itself. But honestly, you can't cut these things back without basically having an armed revolution, right? Like the system is our problems are increasingly regime complete, right? Like every aspect of them is woven into every other aspect, holding up this kind of fugazi that we're all pretending is a real system that we should follow. And Oswald Spengler, of course, talks about this in his cycles of civilizations. This is the time of money power. This is the time of oligarchy. This is the time where people are trapped in these extended, abstract decisions. Your late civilizational phase is one in which the animating spirit is gone, and the only thing left is those like rigid moral systems that we talked about instead of the animating religion itself. And his solution, the one he believes is inevitable, is the great man of history, the Caesar, the conqueror that breaks through the money power situation. And the more you look at things, it's hard to deny that doesn't there seem because if you look, for instance, Elon Musk just went back on his H-1B horse again. Now, this is a guy who has talked about how demographics are destiny and you can't let mass immigration take over Europe and all these things. But for some reason, every time it's time to solve a problem, the solution is more managerialism, more H-1Bs, more placement migration. But it's like he knows there's a problem to his own solutions, but he can't think of any other type of solution because that's just the way a man who has made his living and been rose to power in that way. That's the only way he can address issues and problems. Do you think that ultimately we have to break out of this frame? Is that the only way forward? Is there any way to step off of this road or find another solution to this problem?
I think Sam Francis covered this well with Leviathan and his enemies. He said the end point of the Leviathan would be Caesarism. And I agree. Amaury de Riancourt is a similar author who wrote a book comparing this cycle to the fall of the Roman Republic in the 50s. And he said the same thing. There's a staggering absence of imagination today. And I think that's because imagination is it's dependent on a kind of connection to the spiritual and the divine that we've utterly suppressed. And I say that in a more sort of broad sense than the way an Abrahamic culture would. If you go to ancient Greece or India, there's these ideas, these sort of like different types of consciousness you pull from. But in modernity, we've shut ourselves off from anything that's not very material. So that makes creativity nigh impossible. And so it's really staggering that we are a civilization which is very obviously dying, and we can't even imagine not dying because this is entirely self-enforced. A century ago, the West dominated the world. It was the greatest civilization ever, and it lost due to its lack of any sort of I don't even know what word to use, but we did this to ourselves, and we lack so little imagination. We can't even imagine a world where we don't die. So there's this sense of inevitability to this, to a profoundly non-inevitable thing. And this is one of the parts I find most deeply frustrating, that all of this was utterly self-enforced. This was, if we look for what caused this failure of Western civilization, yes, you could say there was Soviet infiltration. You could say there's certain interest groups, but fundamentally, this was brought on us by us.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, is it some level the hyperstition problem where the more we speak about it, the more we make it inevitable, we summon it into existence? We're the perennialists, right? That simply civilizations must move through this life cycle, and that's even though there's no obvious external cause as to why we should be arriving at this point. We've kind of just hit the internal trigger, in the same way that every plant eventually dies and, wilts and dies. Like, was this truly inevitable? Are we summoning it now? Is there a way to turn this around, as you say, if it is actually imminently avoidable? Or have we set ourselves too far down this path, whether it's our fault or not? Is there just no turning back at this point?
I made a quote saying, you're going to die anyway, so it's better to die rich than poor. And what I mean by that is that all life forms die, humans die, nations die, but you can do more stuff before you die, and that's largely good. And you look at these historic cycles where the 250-year cycle for empires rising and falling, start of the British Empire was 1750, end was 1950. The Arabs started under Muhammad in 650. They died a little after 900. The Spanish Empire started in 1500 and ended in the late 1700s. So it's a fairly consistent theme. And you look back at the founders who clearly knew that American democracy and their regime would fail at some point. They dropped a lot of veiled symbols. They made a lot of references to classical authors who definitely knew this stuff. And so the founders knew that they were operating sort of in time and this wouldn't last forever. And they were complete geniuses at structuring the American Republic in a decentralized way so that at the time of the revolution, we could have split up into a series of independent countries. Pennsylvania and Virginia could have had 50 years of wars over the West, but they didn't because the founders were able to fuse the country together. And so rather than fighting each other and fizzling out in the Great Plains, the Americans made it to Afghanistan and Japan and Somalia and became the de facto rulers of most of Europe. And that's very impressive. But it's interesting how the natural order has its own aims and it uses your best advantages against you. And it's really stark because I'm Gen Z, so I'm pretty young, but I've seen this happen to me in my real life where 2000s, we were such a staggeringly arrogant and self-satisfied society, but then all of our advantages were turned against us. Our huge systems, our interconnected global trade networks, the urbanization, all of those things were turned against us. So now we have a society where the urban populations are the ones who can't procreate. The cities were our great pride and advantage before, but that very same thing was turned against us. So next year will be 250 years since the American Revolution. We had the full cycle, but because we were so rich and successful, the natural order turned our best advantage against us. So we still hit the 250 years. And that's both confusing and sort of warped, but it also fits with just what you know about history.
Right. Yeah, and it's also again what Spangler predicted, that is, the cities, in order for the people to be reanimated, to become vigorous, to become metaphysically connected again, they have to return to the land. The cities are kind of for Spengler, the cities are where the civilization dies. It dies in the cities. It's born in the land. And so I guess if you look in those cycles, it's not particularly surprising ultimately that advantage, while powerful, kind of inevitably seems to draw us towards an end that we're seeing now. Well, I think we've provided a lot of hope, a lot of white pills here today. I think we've told everybody the best they can. Maybe we should do the classic move there. I know you kind of spoke on it, and I agree with this as well. You should die with your boots on, right? Like everything's going to die eventually, and so the key is to be the greatest, to be to achieve the most, to be the most virtuous in the time that you have to spend. So whether you think the United States is doomed or not, you as an individual should be going out and achieving the most you can and living the best life you can. But do you have any hope? Do you have any upsides? Do you have any positive things to lend to people watching today that you might see on the horizon?
I'm glad I offered white pills because I gave black ones last time, but that's just sort of the arc. You have to black pill them first and white pill them later. But one of my mom's quotes was, life is like riding a horse and it's your duty to die in the saddle. And it's the same attitude. And it's any bad situation you can sort of turn to your favor, where you look at a figure like St. Augustine, who grew up and came of age during the fall of Rome. Even in North Africa, there were the Vandal barbarians who were tearing up the region. And he wrote The City of God as a way to create a continuity with the fall of Rome, because the collapse of the society created this huge spiritual void. So that's the worst possible condition. St. Augustine did something with it. Or you look at a figure like Winston Churchill, who was at the death throes of the British Empire, and he still rose to be one of the great statesmen of that century. And so even in bad situations, you can find a way to make it work out for you or for your small group of people.
Absolutely. And this is why I think so many people are pushing localism, pushing the idea of scaling down community, finding the people that you can work with and together build a future, weather any times that may come. And so there is no excuse to not be doing that. Sitting around and waiting for Donald Trump or JD Vance or someone else to save you is a fool's errand. Maybe they will. Maybe our great man of history will come in and save us all, and won't that be amazing? But until then, you have to cultivate a situation in which you can win, your family can win, your community can win, and that is definitely where you should be putting your effort. All right, guys, like I said, we are not live today, so unfortunately we'll not be able to go to the questions of the people. However, can you let people know where to find all of your great work?
You can watch my YouTube channels, What If Alt Hist and History 102. They're both for free on YouTube. And thank you so much for having me.
Of course. Thanks for coming by. All right, guys. If it's your first time on YouTube, make sure you subscribe. Make sure you click the bell notification so you know when we go live. If you'd like to get these broadcasts as podcasts, you need to subscribe to the Auron MacIntyre Show on your favorite podcast platform. And if you do, leave a rating or review. It helps with the algorithm magic. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And as always, I will talk to you next time.